Today we're looking at conjugate acid-base pairs. We're going to do it by looking at some examples and explaining what they actually are. So you get a conjugate acid-base pair when two species differ from each other by only one proton, an H+. And we're going to look at an example of methanoic acid, which becomes a methanoate ion when it loses the H+ proton. And here's the equation, so you can see the methanoic acid on the left forming the methionate ion on the right and the hydrogen ion, the proton. And the species differ, methanoic acid and methionate ion, simply by the difference of one proton. And we can use these square brackets and we get a conjugate acid-base pair. And we've got the reversible arrow and a review here of acid-base definitions, and you can pause to look at all of them. We're interested in Brønsted-Lowry here, where the acid is a proton donor and the base is a proton acceptor. And the equation can also be written more fully with water, because acids have acid properties with protons in aqueous solutions, and there's a second conjugate acid-base pair with the proton now associated with the water molecule H3O+. And so that's acidic. The H3O+ is an acid because it can donate a proton, and the H2O can accept one, obviously, when it becomes H3O+. And we've got the proton acceptor and the proton donor labelled with the square bracket on the bottom equation. And we can have a general equation here with the acid HA and the base letter B, and HA and A- are a conjugate acid-base pair, and B and H plus B a second conjugate acid-base pair. So some species can behave both as an acid and a base in the two reactions below, and they're called amphoteric because they're both acidic and basic. And if you look at number 1, the hydrogen carbonate ion, when it's in the presence of water, it actually loses a proton, so it's a proton donor here. It's an acid, and it becomes a carbonate ion. In the second of the two equations, the hydrogen carbonate ion gains a proton and becomes H2CO3, carbonic acid, so it's a proton acceptor, so here it's going to be the conjugate base. And there are other amphoteric species, hydrogen sulfate, dihydrogen phosphate, and monohydrogen phosphate. Notice the different charges on both of those. So let's look at some questions. And we've got 1 and 2, and asking for both of them, what would be the conjugate acid of both of those species? We'll look at number 1 first. So you're being asked for a conjugate acid, and so you're being told really that C2H5COO- is the base, the conjugate base. And if it's a base, it's going to accept a proton. So pause and write the formula of what it will become when it accepts the proton. And here it's forming the propanoic acid, and there's the equation for it as well. And with the number 2, again, it's going to be a base here because it's going to accept an H+. and then make the conjugate acid. So what does it become? So again, pause while you write the answer. And it's going to become sulfuric acid. And look at the equation there of the hydrogen sulfate ion gaining a proton to become sulfuric acid. We've got a couple more similar but different questions. What is the conjugate base of these two species? So the first one is sulfurous acid, and you're being asked for a conjugate base. So you are given an acid. An acid is a proton donor, and what will it become when the H2SO3 donates a proton? Pause while you write that the answer to that one. So it's giving up a proton. It becomes the bisulfate ion HSO3-. And look at the equation with number 3 there. And number 4, you start off with the hydrogen sulfate ion, and what's the conjugate base? So this must be an acid, it must be a proton donor. So HSO4- is a proton donor. What species is formed when it donates a proton, the H+? Pause while you answer that one. And we've got, it becomes the sulfate ion. And look at the equation, the HSO4- and the SO42-, those are your conjugate acid-base pair, and the difference between the hydrogen sulfate and sulfate is an H+, a proton. And for number 5, we've got to identify Brønsted-Lowry acid, the proton donor, and the base, the proton acceptor, and identify the conjugate acid-base pairs, and plural, because there's going to be 2 of them in an equation like this. So the question first is, which species are proton donors? Got a clue here with some red circles, but pause while you write them down. And so you've got that ethanoic acid and the ammonium ion are proton donors. So that would be the Brønsted-Lowry acid. And what do they become when they donate the H+? The ethanoic acid becomes ethanoate, and the ammonium ion becomes ammonia. And if you look at the equation with the square brackets, you'll see that you've got 2 conjugate acid-base pairs, ethanoic acid and the ethanoate ion, and ammonia and the ammonium ion. And which are the proton acceptors? We've looked at proton donors, so the other 2 species are proton acceptors, so they're going to be the Brønsted-Lowry bases. And the answer is just written there. And then what do those 2 species become, ammonia and the ethanoate ion, become when they accept a proton? So pause while you write the answer to that one. So the ethanoate ion will become ethanoic acid, so looking at the reverse reaction there, the ammonia becomes the ammonium ion when it accepts a proton. And we then look at the equation with the square brackets, and again the same pairs of conjugate acid-base pairs there. And number 6 here, which species are proton donors? And again, you've been given a hint here with some red circles. And then we want to know what they become when they donate the proton. So pause while you answer that question. The ammonium ion becomes ammonia, and in the reverse direction, the nitric acid would become the nitrite ion, NO2 minus. And then you've got the conjugate acid-base pairs of those species. And here we have the equation with the square brackets clearly showing the two conjugate acid-base pairs that are possible from this equation. So it's all about proton accepting and proton donating, and the difference between the conjugate acid-base pair is simply a proton. So many thanks to WIS Chemistry and the intrepid 2021 seniors. Thank you.